The only sound Jake could hear as the sun set and the sky became orange and purple was the crackle of the campfire. He had always enjoyed going camping alone since the peace and quiet of the outdoors was a welcome change of pace from the busy city life he was used to. This location, which is tucked away in the Blackwood Forest, was new to him. He found it through a little-known hiking forum. Jake withdrew to his tent as darkness fell, the tiny room illuminated by the warm glow of his headlamp. The sounds of the woodland lulled him into a state of calm as he climbed into his sleeping bag. A calming natural symphony was produced by the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze and distant owl hoots. He was on the verge of falling asleep when he heard a noise. He initially believed it to be the wind, but upon closer listening, he discovered it was something else entirely. Soft, hazy whispers seemed to drift across the night air. Jake's heart rate increased as his eyes sprung open. Holding his breath, he strained to hear better. Seemingly from right outside his tent, the murmurs persisted. The cadence was clearly that of speech, yet they were too faint to discern any words. "Hello?" Jake's voice sounded abnormally loud in the still night as he called out. "Is there anybody there?" The murmurs stopped suddenly. Jake opened his tent and looked out into the night. He could see no one, but the moonlight created unsettling shadows amid the woods. After grabbing his flashlight, he went outside and walked about the campsite, sweeping the beam. "Hello?" he called again, more loudly. He was only answered by the echo of his own voice. Jake shook his head, trying to deceive himself into thinking it was all in his head. He zipped his tent shut and slipped back inside. He laughed nervously at his own jitteriness as he lay back down. However, the whispers reappeared as soon as he closed his eyes. They were joined this time by a different sound, the gentle crunch of footfall on the woodland floor. Jake's blood froze. The steady, purposeful footsteps appeared to be surrounding his tent. His heart was beating so loudly that he sat up, certain that whatever was out there could hear it. There was silence for a minute as the footsteps stopped. Then a shadow, the outline of something clearly human in shape, fell across the side of the tent. Jake groped for the tent zipper, his hand shaking. What was out there had to be known to him. He quickly opened the tent and rushed outside, flashlight in hand. Nothing. As before, there was no one at the campsite. Jake whirled around, his flashlight beam piercing the night, but nothing or anyone was in sight. In an attempt to quiet his racing mind, he ran a trembling hand through his hair. "Jake, get a grip," he whispered to himself. "This place is empty." He didn't believe it, though, even as he said it. The darkness between the trees, which concealed unknown secrets, suddenly made the woodland feel oppressive. Jake made the decision he had had enough. He would get ready and depart as soon as the sun rose. He couldn't sleep the rest of the night. With his flashlight ready, he sat bolt upright at every snapping twig and leaf rustle. Even though he didn't hear the whispers again, the thought of them made him nervous. Jake exhaled a sigh of relief as the first rays of dawn appeared through the trees. He had survived the night. He unzipped his tent and went out into the cool morning air, eager to get out of the woodland. His blood turned to ice at what he witnessed. There were symbols all around his camp, carved into the tree bark. Strange, cryptic glyphs that appeared to shine dimly in the darkness. Jake walked over to the closest tree and reached out to touch the sign, his hand trembling. Sap was still seeping from the wounds in the recently sliced bark surrounding it. He looked from one tree to another. His encampment was surrounded by a flawless circle of symbols. It had been playing with him, marking its territory, or marking him, whatever had been out here throughout the night. Jake breathed in quick, frantic gasps. He whirled around, feeling suddenly vulnerable and exposed. The forest that had appeared so friendly the day before suddenly felt evil, alive with an unknown, sinister force. Somewhere in the brush, a twig broke. Jake's eyes were wide with terror as he spun toward the sound. A figure was standing there, right at the edge of the clearing. Despite having a humanoid shape, it was nonetheless incorrect, too tall, too thin, and with limbs at strange angles. It stood motionless for a minute, observing him. Then creature lifted a long, spindly arm slowly and pointed at Jake. The whispers came back, but this time they were loud and unclear, with multiple voices speaking simultaneously in languages Jake didn't understand. The thing started to approach him, its motions erratic and strange. Jake didn't hold out for more. His tent, his supplies, everything was gone as he turned and fled. With every stride he took, the roots threatened to trip him, and branches whipped at his face as he crashed into the underbrush. The murmurs trailed after him, becoming louder and more persistent. He ran till his legs felt like lead and his lungs burned. It was only then that he dared to turn around. There was no trace of a pursuit in the woodland behind him. The typical sounds of the woods had taken the place of the whispering. Leaning against the tree, Jake took a deep breath. Was it all in his head? Was he going crazy? In an attempt to comprehend what had transpired, he closed his eyes. His heart almost stopped when he opened them again. Another symbol, fresh, the sap still wet, was cut into the tree he was leaning on. Beyond it, he could make out further symbols on other trees, creating a path that led farther into the woods. A fresh murmur, closer than ever, came to his ears. He was able to discern words this time. "Jake, stay on course. We have been anticipating your arrival." No one was nearby to hear Jake scream as it reverberated across the jungle. Another victim had been taken by the Blackwood Forest, and the night's murmurs ceased once more, while they awaited the next gullible camper to wander into their territory. In the weeks that followed, search teams scouted the forest but discovered no sign of Jake or his camp. The only indication to his absence was a string of odd symbols etched into the trees, creating an apparently endless path that headed farther and farther into the center of the forest. In addition, hikers occasionally claimed to hear whispers amid the Blackwood Forest trees on calm nights when the wind is motionless, beckoning them to pursue a route that leads to nowhere. The outdoors had always been a haven for Sarah. The Pacific Northwest's thick forests served as her haven, where the stresses of the outside world seemed to vanish as she ventured more into the lush embrace of the natural world. The purpose of this specific camping trip was to serve as a kind of celebration, her 30th birthday, spent by herself in the peace and quiet of the Olympic National Forest. On her first day, Sarah made camp in a small clearing as twilight fell, with the tall evergreens surrounding her like sentinels. Her tent was set up on a level spot of land, her cooking supplies were arranged by the fire pit, and her reliable bag was propped up against a nearby tree. Each thing found its home as if led by muscle memory, and the routine was reassuring. The cricket's soft symphony and the owl's distant hoot lulled Sarah into a deep, dreamless sleep as the night went by without incident. Sarah's world didn't turn on its axis until the first rays of light broke through the canopy. There was an eerie silence when she woke up. It was disturbingly silent in the forest, which is normally bustling with the sounds of birds welcoming the dawn. Ready to start her day with a cup of coffee prepared over the campfire, Sarah crept out of her tent, her joints popping as she stretched. She became aware of it at that point. Or rather, failed to observe it. She had lost her backpack. Sarah, convinced that she must be mistaken, blinked and wiped the sleep from her eyes. But reality set in as her vision cleared. The ground was undisturbed, and the tree on which she had carefully supported her luggage was barren. She mumbled, "What the?" as she slowly circled. Her eyes scanned the campsite, becoming more and more anxious by the moment. Her backpack wasn't the only item missing. Only the chilly ashes from last night's fire remained after the orderly stack of cooking items had disappeared. Sarah's heart started pounding. In the night, had she been robbed? However, how? Years of camping alone had made her a light sleeper who would wake up at the first sign of trouble. Why would you remove her provisions but not her tent? "Hello?" In the deafening quiet of the jungle, she cried out, her voice little and frail. "Who's there?" Her only response was the echo of her own words. Sarah inhaled deeply in an attempt to relax. "Consider rationally," she said. "Some explanation must exist." Bears were her first thought. Black bears, who were noted for their curiosity and sometimes audacity near campsites, lived in the Olympic National Forest. However, bears were untidy. Instead of removing her possessions surgically, they would have left a trail of devastation. Sarah started walking around her campsite, looking for any indications of a disturbance. At that moment, she noticed footprints. However, these were not animal footprints. There was a route that led from her camp and farther into the woods, and the impressions in the soft dirt were obviously human. Sarah felt a shiver go down her back. While she slept, vulnerable and oblivious, someone had been here, strolling around her camp in silence. Sarah chose to pursue the tracks against her better judgment. Not only did she need her supplies, but she also needed explanations. As if to hold her back, branches snagged at her clothing as the trail carried her through a thicket of underbrush. Sarah froze after tracking intently for 5 minutes or so. Her backpack was in a little clearing up ahead, and the ingredients she uses to cook, as well as her water bottles. Every object had been positioned precisely, facing inward, as though in some strange ritual, and everything had been organized in a perfect circle. In spite of the warm morning air, Sarah approached warily, her skin tingling with chills. She spotted something that chilled her as she got closer. A tiny, shabby doll stood in the middle of the circle of her possessions. It was constructed from leaves and twigs and was secured with what appeared to be human hair. Her mother had given her a birthday pendant, which she had hidden in her luggage, and it hung around its neck. She heard a twig snap behind her. With her heart thumping so fiercely that she could feel it in her throat, Sarah spun around. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by a huge Douglas fir. Although its shape seemed humanoid, there was something strange about its proportions. Its limbs are excessively lengthy for its torso, and it is extremely tall and slender. Neither moved for a second. Sarah was paralyzed by a horror more primordial than anything she had ever encountered, and she was unable to breathe. The hauntingly human gesture of the figure tilting its head only added to its otherworldly appearance. Then it started to emerge gently from behind the tree. Sarah became paralyzed. She turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no regard for direction. She continued to run despite the branches whipping at her face and the roots threatening to trip her. Behind her, she could hear something moving with unnatural ease. Sarah exploded out of the tree line and onto a broad route just as her lungs felt like they were about to explode. She noticed a park ranger post 100 yards to her left. She screamed for assistance as she ran toward it with a last surge of speed. At the sound of her cries, Tom, the middle-aged ranger on duty, hurried outside. Sarah fell, her legs finally failing, and he caught her. Tom's voice was calm but worried as he said, "Whoa, easy there. What took place? Are you in pain?" Sarah tried to describe the strange arrangement in the clearing, the tracks, the relocated possessions, and the monster that had pursued her in between breathless breaths. Tom patiently listened as each detail caused his brow to furrow further. When she was done, he said, "Let's get you inside. A search team will be dispatched to inspect your campsite and the location where you found your belongings." Sarah looked back at the edge of the trees as they walked into the station. She briefly believed that she had spotted a tall, slender figure among the woods. However, it vanished when she blinked. Sarah's campsite was discovered by the search crew unaltered. She found her backpack lying against the tree, exactly where she had left it. The fire pit had her culinary supplies in precisely the same order she remembered. No footprints led into the trees, and there was no indication of the clearing with the circle of possessions. When the rangers returned, Sarah objected. "But that's impossible. I am aware of what I observed. It was authentic." Tom touched her shoulder reassuringly. "In the wilderness, the mind can deceive us," he remarked softly. "Particularly when we're alone ourselves. Why don't you leave and go back home? Take a nap?" Sarah reluctantly consented. She couldn't get rid of the feeling that she was being watched as she collected her possessions, all of which were there and accounted for. She jumped at every sound of leaves rustling and twigs breaking. Sarah didn't start to unwind until she was in her car, miles away from the Olympic National Forest. As a comforting habit, she reached up to touch her birthday pendant. All she could find with her hand was exposed flesh. Sarah pulled down the sun visor and peered in the mirror, her fingers shaking. The pendant was no longer there. Where the chain had been, there was a tiny red line that was hardly perceptible against her flesh. Half expecting to see a tall, slender person in the back seat, Sarah's eyes shot to the rearview mirror. Even though the car was empty, she noticed something when she turned to face the road. There was a small twig and leaf doll fastened to her steering wheel. Sarah's tires screeched in protest as she swerved off the road, a scream catching in her throat. Leaving the engine running, she clambered out of the car and started sprinting along the highway, waving frantically at passing vehicles. Sarah recognized the truth, though, even as she ran. Her supplies had not been targeted by whatever had come to her camp that evening or organized her possessions in that magical circle. She had been the target. It was now aware of her residence. Among the old trees, the Olympic National Forest whispers many secrets. However, none are more frightful than the myth of the collector, a creature that not only appropriates your possessions but also claims you as its own. Local campers occasionally claim waking up to discover their equipment changed or catching a sight of incredibly tall, slender beings scuttling amongst the trees at dusk. If you listen carefully on quiet evenings, you may also hear footsteps surrounding your tent and the gentle, almost affectionate murmur. Soon you'll be part of my collection.